One of the reasons we have rules and procedures, guidelines and codes is not because there is consensus, but because there isn't. And in these circumstances, we need mechanisms to resolve our disagreements despite our differences. One of the great virtues historically of parliamentary democracy has been that it has developed historically as a device, a very locally specific device, to be sure, for resolving disagreements while allowing them to be articulated. It's far from perfect, but it's accepted in some locations. The challenge in developing new forms of governance is precisely the same, namely how to address differences while recognizing they exist or might come to exist. The problem is when they are not acknowledged, or they are only acknowledged implicitly. So in my own work on oil companies, there's a kind of vast production of information by oil companies about what they are doing, but often the other side, the problems which they are often accused of being engaged with, such as corruption, are not mentioned. There's the problem, there's a kind of implicit other to the development of the transnational regime of governance, which is not necessarily clearly visible. The biggest mistake, I think, is to imagine that production of knowledge will necessarily enable us to resolve our differences. On the contrary, the question of what is known and what is not known, or should be known, is at the heart of the matters about which we disagree. Thirdly, as I've said, the situations that I'm concerned with clearly aren't just the product of the work of human communities. One needs to give proper attention to what Bruno Latour would call non-human actors. Problems of governance are provoked as much by the behavior of materials, of things, their resistance, their disturbance, as the behavior of humans. One can't understand innovation in governance about environmental matters in particular, in issues such as waste disposal, climate change and so on, without thinking about the material properties of waste or the dynamics of the atmosphere. But I want to make a further point, which is that if we look at the trajectory of the development of new transnational forms of governance, they don't actually serve to contain disagreements very well. Or they may in some cases, and they may establish hegemonic forms. In some cases. Of course, on the one hand, they can suffer from all the well-known problems of emerging political forms, particularly self-regulatory forms, a lack of accountability and lack of legitimacy and so on. But on the other hand, they do not serve to reduce the level of disagreements. Rather, they might foster a new level of intensity of disagreement about what is known, providing a kind of catalytic surface for knowledge controversies, making it particularly important to disagree about matters of fact, creating a kind of spiral. Consider, for example, the importance of transparency, a core principle in the development of transnational governance mechanisms today. It's an innovation in governance, to be sure. But greater transparency certainly does not reduce the range of knowledge controversies at all, or the range of kind of political situations of which I've talked about. For example, in the extractive industries, there's been a global effort to ensure better governance through the development of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which expects both oil companies and governments to publish what they pay to each other, and the accounts are assessed by local EITI committees made up of members of civil society. The extent of transparency demanded by the Transparency Initiative is actually relatively little, and those who promote transparency could be understood perhaps as a transnational community. But the initiative is expected to address what I've termed a political situation, the problem of the causes and consequences of extractive industry revenues, corruption, violence, and so on. But potentially at least, EITI provides a catalyst for knowledge controversies. On the one hand, it generates the possibility of controversies about what is made public through the EITI process, but it also opens up the possibility for disputes about what the EITI does not reveal. The operation of transparency in practice points implicitly, perhaps, to a domain of activities about which little is made public or cannot be made public. When matters are expected to be transparent, there needs to be discretion about what might need to be made transparent in the future, but was not. And potentially controversy develops around what is not publicly known, but is known by some or found out by some unofficially. The anthropologist Michael Taussig has coined the term public secrets to refer to those things that are widely known but are not officially made public or transparent. In many of the countries in which EITI is considered most successful, are also considered the most corrupt, in which public secrets about corruption are commonplace and controversies about public secrets exist. One might view the democratizing movements in North Africa and the Middle East, at least in part, as movements provoked by what was actually widely known and experienced in everyday life, but never officially acknowledged. A consideration of innovation in governance, the subject of this conference, is, I think, critical. Governance is in flux, and it's important to capture this dynamic. But there are clearly two dangers in the two key words in the title of this initiative, if you'll forgive me. Innovation is not something we generally disagree with. Who can be against innovation? And governance can be understood as a set of principles, rules, procedures, organizational forms, technical devices, which enable disagreement to be resolved in a good way. Isn't governance about quelling the level of public disagreement, the intensity of public disagreement, the violence of public disagreement increasingly, translating it into a more manageable and more rational form? Isn't governance partly about addressing the problem of the antagonistic disputes that can emerge all too often between the rulers and the ruled? I simply want to complement our emphasis on innovation in governance, which I applaud, by drawing attention to the political situations with which they coexist, with which innovations in governance are entangled, and which actually they foster too. I'll stop there.